All right, we should be live right now. I'm just gonna double check that everything's looking good on my end. And yeah, for today, we are just gonna be, I just finished reading Exodus, so now we're going to be researching Exodus. So, all right, we should going into basically, uh, that looks good on my end. All right. Basically just going into, other people's opinions on the validity and what have you. Um, so that's what we're gonna be doing. One second. All right. All right, everything's looking Gucci. So let's get it going. All right. I'd like to start off with I do appreciate inspiring philosophy. I think he does a pretty good job from a more pro um biblical perspective, you know what I mean? So we might start with that. Then I do like Useful Charts does also some good stuff from a more secular perspective. Let's see. Useful Charts. And who knows, we might watch some other stuff. You know, here's a good one. Let's start with that. I think that this is something that has been, as I read Exodus, something that definitely sort of weighed on my mind. Like, is this, uh, you know, is he a real person?
Special collaboration between Useful Charts, Let's Talk Religion, and Al Mukaddama. In this series of 3 videos, we will be exploring whether or not.
All right, let's
Let's
jump into
start
it.
by asking the question, how do we know that anyone in history really existed? Well, the best evidence would be, of course, to find a person's physical remains. So take, for example, King Richard III of England. According to the historical record, he died in 1485 during the Battle of Bosworth Field, after which he was supposedly buried at a small church in the nearby town of Leicester. However, over time, the exact location was forgotten and thus became unknown. That is, until 2012, when researchers found his skeleton under a parking lot. Using radiocarbon dating, DNA tests, and other forms of analysis, scientists were able to conclude beyond any reasonable doubt that the bones were in fact those of Richard III. But what about someone from much further back? Say, for example, Alexander the Great, who supposedly died in 323 BCE. Unfortunately, the exact location of Alexander's tomb has become lost to history, and therefore we do not have his physical remains. However, in the case of Alexander, we have the next best thing, which is solid archaeological evidence for his existence. For example, we have many sculptures of his face, some of which date very close to his lifetime or are exact copies of.
Yeah, having evidence that is close to when the person actually lived. Be different if all these sculptures and everything were like 500 years later, contemporary to the time period of which the person lives. You have likeness, like sculptures and stuff being made of the person.
Of now lost originals that were made when he was still alive. We also have coins with his face on them, which were minted during his lifetime. We also have inscriptions, like this one from the Temple of Athena in Priene, Greece, that dates from when he visited the location. It reads, King Alexander dedicated this to Athenia Polias. We even have foreign sources, like this one written in Babylonian cuneiform and dated to his lifetime, which records Alexander's victory over the Persian king Darius III. So, even though we do not have the physical remains of Alexander the Great, we can still say beyond any reasonable doubt that he did in fact exist.
Yeah, solid. That's what we call solid evidence. Archaeological evidence, but yeah, other people talking about them, dating all to the time period that the person lived. Um, yeah, that's definitely helps with building a case for anybody to show that they actually existed, especially from such long time ago, such a long time ago.
But what about cases where we don't have any archaeological evidence dating from when the person was still alive? All three of the religious figures in this series, Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, fall into this category. In these cases, we have to rely entirely on textual sources. And by textual sources, I don't mean a few words carved into stone. I mean lengthy works of literature, usually written first on parchment and then later copied onto paper and made into books. This is where things get a bit tricky because
Okay, so far all we have is textual evidence for Moses. Now, how strong that evidence is, we will delve into because they're not all created equal. Not all textual evidence is created equal.
when it comes to ancient history, we often get textual sources that differ from one another when it comes to what actually happened. This leads some people to conclude that there's no way of knowing the truth, and that it's just a matter of arbitrarily choosing who you want to believe. But this is not the case. Scholars have developed a method called the historical method for determining which sources are more likely than others to be true. Here are some of the things that they consider. First, does the source match the archaeological record? So, for example, if a text claims that King so and so had an army with 1 million soldiers, but archaeologists dig up that king's main cities and discover that they were much too small to support a number that large, the accuracy of that textual source is definitely going to come into question.
Yeah, that definitely that example I feel like is definitely targeted at where the Book of Genesis claims that there was um the Israelites left Egypt with 600,000 men strong, not counting the women and children, just 600,000 men. After the the Book of Genesis records that according to the Bible, 430 years prior, they came into Egypt with 70 people total, and now they have a million plus people, at least 1.2 mil in 430 years. I mean, yeah, that seems extremely high and unlikely.
2. Are there multiple sources that all tell the same story? Say we have 10 different sources that all state that the Greeks beat the Persians in a particular battle, but only one source that states that the Persians beat the Greeks. In a case like this, it's probably safe to assume that the 10 are right and the 1 is wrong. 3. Is there any chance that the source is biased? It's quite obvious from ancient sources.
Well, is there any chance that practically every historical source is, I mean, every humans are just biased, but I think a better question is there any chance that the source is propaganda or manufactured for more of a purpose of propaganda? Just asking, is there any chance? The chance is like 99%, in my opinion. So I think that's kind of a goofy way to phrase that question.
sources that rulers liked to boast about their accomplishments and often exaggerated things. So, if we happen to have an account written by a neutral third party who
Sure.
just happened to be living nearby, there's a greater chance that their account is going to be more accurate. 4. How much time passed between the event and the written account of the event? This one's easy. Basically, if a text was written very close to an event, it's far more likely to be accurate than a text that was written many centuries later. Finally, number 5. What genre of writing was used? Another assumption that a lot of people make, but are wrong in making, is that all ancient people wrote history in the same way that we write it today. Nowadays, history falls very clearly into the category of non-fiction and tends to be written in a very straightforward, linear fashion, focusing on facts and figures with utmost accuracy. But history was not always written like this. The further back in time you go, you'll find that for ancient people, history was more of a story, and the main point of the story was far more important to them than all the nitty-gritty details. If we come across a text that clearly uses literary tropes that were common at the time, we need to consider whether or not the details in that text should be considered in a literal or a figurative way. Let's now turn our attention to Moses and go through these 5 questions again, this time with Moses in mind. But first, I'd like to take this opportunity to point out that in addition to being a history educator, I also happen to be Jewish. So if you don't like my conclusions, please don't assume that I came to these conclusions simply because I'm anti-religious. 'Cause, well, I'm not. Anyway, the oldest source we have for the life of Moses is, as you might have guessed, the Bible. In particular, the Torah, which refers to the first 5 books of the Bible. According to the Torah, Moses was born in Egypt during a time when his people, the Israelites, were slaves there. As a baby, Moses was placed in a basket in the Nile River, where he was then found by one of Pharaoh's daughters. After growing up in the royal palace, Moses then commits murder as an adult and has to escape to the land of Midian, where he then has a spiritual experience in which God speaks to him in the form of a burning bush. There, God instructs Moses to return to Egypt and to lead his enslaved people out of that country and into Canaan, the promised land, which he then does after God sends a series of 10 plagues on Egypt. From there, we get the famous parting of the Red Sea story, the receiving of the 10 Commandments, and the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years. At the end of the biblical account, Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land. So it is his successor Joshua that takes over and conquers most of the land of Canaan in a very dramatic fashion. Okay, so let's first consider whether or not this account lines up with the archaeological record. According to the Bible, the number of male slaves
Yeah, this was numbers. That's also in Exodus. Yeah.
who left Egypt with Moses was 600,000, meaning that the total number of Israelites, counting women and children, was likely around 2 million. Also, according to the Bible, Moses would have lived somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE. The exact date depends on one's interpretation of the chronological data, and there are a lot of conflicting theories on that I won't go into. Suffice to say, it was somewhere around 1500 to 1200 BCE. Well, there is nothing in the archaeological record for that time period, or any other time period for that matter, to suggest a sudden population drop of 2 million people within Egypt, nor 2 million people traveling through the Sinai Peninsula, nor 2 million people suddenly arriving in Canaan and replacing the existing population there. Even if the Egyptians tried to cover up their embarrassing defeat in their records and monuments, there would have been no way to cover up all the physical evidence that would have resulted from the movement of that many people. However, this doesn't prove that there was never a guy named Moses that left Egypt. It simply indicates that he didn't leave Egypt with 2 million people. There's still the possibility that there might have been some sort of exodus, led by some sort of Moses-like figure, but that it was simply on a much smaller scale. This is what Hebrew scholar Richard Friedman suggests in his book, The
Yeah, so no evidence for 2 million Israelites leaving Egypt. I'd put it more, maybe it's like 1.8, but 2 million's fine.
Exodus. He points out that members of the tribe of Levi often had Egyptian sounding names, but that other Israelites did not. Names like Hophni and Phinehas, and even Moses. All of these Levite names have Egyptian origins. So maybe out of the 12 tribes, it was only the tribe of Levi that came from Egypt. As I mentioned earlier, the Moses story.
Interesting. Hmm. That is peculiar.
Is also closely associated with a place called Midian. And according to the archaeological record, we know that there was a.
However, maybe the Levites were in cahoots with the Egyptians and had a bit of a higher place amongst the tribes of Israel. Hence why maybe Moses and the other Levites kind of seemingly acted in a more authoritarian manner in certain instances.
A people group living in that area around that time called the Shasu, who happened to have been sometimes enslaved by the Egyptians, and who happened to have worshipped a god with a very similar name to the god that the Israelites ended up worshipping. So there's also the possibility we know that the tribe of Levi that came from Egypt. As I mentioned earlier, the Moses story is also closely associated with a place called Midian. And according to the archaeological record, we know that there was a people group living in that area around that time called the Shasu, who.
Huh, this is interesting.
Happened to have been sometimes enslaved by the Egyptians, and who happened to have worshipped a god with a very similar name to the god that the Israelites ended up worshipping. So there's also the possibility that Moses was actually a Midianite, or a member of the Shasu, and that he became an important figure in Israelite history because he was the one who introduced them to Hashem. Moving on, let's now consider the second question. How does the source, in this case the Bible, compare to other textual sources? Well, you might be surprised to find out that there were actually many different versions of the Moses story floating about in the ancient world. For example, in some Hellenistic versions, he's mostly remembered for building a city or establishing a temple, often within Egypt itself, not in Israel. In others, he's the one who invented the alphabet through the guidance of Thoth, or the for building.
Hold on, I gotta take some notes before I hear this. What is going on here? So wait, what are these?
For example, in some Hellenistic versions, he's mostly remembered for building a city or establishing a temple, often within Egypt itself, not in Israel. In
Hellenistic, so Greek? What? Where are these sources coming from?
others, he's the one who invented the alphabet through the guidance of Thoth, or the one who first introduced the Egyptians to the idea of written laws. According to the famous Roman historian Tacitus, Moses did leave Egypt to colonize Canaan, but according to that version, the Israelites were in the desert for only 6 days, arriving in Canaan with Moses on the 7th. But perhaps the most interesting variant is the one written by Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest and historian living in the Ptolemaic period. It is primarily from Manetho that we learn about an Asiatic people called the Hyksos, who temporarily ruled Lower Egypt just prior to the time of Moses, before getting kicked out and forced back to Canaan. Hhowever, Manetho also tells a story about an Egyptian priest named Osarseph, who lived just after the Hyksos period. In this story, the pharaoh enslaves a group of lepers, but then Osarseph unites the lepers with the help of the Hyksos and forms an army, defeating the pharaoh. Osarseph then goes on to rule Egypt for 13 years, destroying all other temples except his own, before finally being defeated by the returning pharaoh and forced out of the country. At this point, Osarseph changes his name to Moses. Obviously, this story about Moses has some parallels to the biblical story about Moses, but it also has some major differences.
Yeah, some parallels? Uniting the lepers, I guess? Or the enslaved peoples?
On top of this, Manetho's account and the biblical account both seem to have parallels to the reign of a historically verified pharaoh named Akhenaten, who lived around the same time as Moses and is mostly remembered for having promoted an early type of monotheism. But the bottom line is this. There are many different versions of the Moses story out there in the historical record, but none of them seem to line up nicely. The only common thread seems to be that he was some sort of renegade leader who introduced some bold ideas. In other words, based on other textual sources, there is nothing available that can be used to demonstrate that the details given in the Bible about Moses' life are historical. The third thing we need to consider is the possibility of bias in our various sources. And here, unfortunately, I think it is fair to say that no unbiased sources of Moses' life exist. The biblical account is obviously biased because the main point of the Bible is to promote a particular religious worldview. However, the non-biblical accounts are just as biased. Most of them were written during the Hellenistic period, a time when anti-Jewish propaganda was common. So it's quite possible that the non-biblical versions of the Moses story were deliberately crafted to put some sort of a political twist on the Jewish version of the Moses story. What about the time difference for the various sources? As Al-Muqaddimah points out in his video about Muhammad, the amount of time between the death of Muhammad and the first mention of his name in a non-Islamic source is 8 years. And as Let's Talk Religion points out in his video about Jesus, the amount of time between the death of Jesus and the first mention of his name in a non-Christian source is 63 years. For Moses, it's a completely different story. Using round numbers, the amount of time between the death of Moses and the first mention of his name in a non-Jewish source is approximately 1,000 years. And even the time difference between the death of Moses and the earliest stage of the Torah's development is around 750 years. So considering the fact that the
All right, gotta take some notes here. Let's see, we're on how much time has passed. Yeah. Roughly 750 years between Moses' death and the what I would call the definitive version of the Torah. Definitive version of the Torah. Oops.
archaeological evidence contradicts the biblical account of Moses.
Hold on. I gotta write some more notes here. All right.
And that there are numerous conflicting accounts of Moses' life in the various other textual sources, and that all of these textual sources are likely biased and were written many, many centuries after he supposedly lived. I think the only conclusion we can come to is that Moses is more of a legendary figure than a historical one. Now, this doesn't mean that he for sure didn't exist. It simply means that the information we have about him is probably a mix of truth and fiction. And we have no way of knowing how much is truth and how much is fiction.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. But that's the reality on the ground.
Unless, of course, we rely solely on religious faith. But there's one more question that we haven't yet considered, and that is, what genre of writing was used in the biblical account of Moses? Like I said, ancient people did not always write history in the way that we write it today. For them, historical accounts were often far more literary in nature, and they mixed facts with embellishments in order to craft an overall story that made an important point, not one that simply recorded exactly what happened and when. There are many clear examples of literary tropes in the biblical story of Moses. For example, although he was born into a low-class family, he ended up being adopted into royalty. This is a common theme found in many ancient stories, as well as several modern ones. Even the fact that he was placed into a basket in a river was a common theme. One legend, a source for which is older than the Torah, states the following about Sargon of Akkad, who lived over 1,000 years before Moses and is well attested in the historical record.
My mother, the high priestess, conceived. In secret she bore me. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen she sealed my lid. She cast me into the river which rose over me.
Then there's the familiar trope of the prince or princess who wanders out of the palace one day, only to discover how hard life is for the everyday folk. Or the hero who has to go on the run, only to come back and accomplish some major feat at some later point. Even the parting
What I would say is I don't know how much of these were considered tropes, even at 750 BC. Like, I don't know if people even had the concept of trope. Sure, I mean, the whole thing about Sargon being in a basket and down the river. Sometimes art inspires reality as much as like art can copy art, reality can also copy art. Um, Again, if we're talking about, I don't know how, you know, it's like say it did happen and there was a basket and Moses was placed in that basket. Say that actually did happen. First off, I doubt those people had ever heard of the Sargon of Akkad story. Um, Doubt that, the fact that that happened once every 750 years isn't much of a trope yet, unless there's other stories. And again, stories like those can actually inspire people to do what they read about and be like, oh, well, so such and such did this. Maybe I should do that as well. Despite the fact that it might be a fictional story, it can kind of inspire people to act in a certain way. Um, Hope, especially if you have like maybe a naive or a really young person, you know what I mean? So I don't know if we can. I mean, just because you need to have more than just one example for me to go, oh, they copied it. You know what I mean? Um, however, it is still something to consider that as far as the context of the Nile, and the Nile is a fairly, for the most part, compared to most rivers as far as I'm aware, fairly gentle. It makes sense that you could do that and had to summit success as far as like maybe somebody finding it because people are around the river all the time. It's you know, the majority of the population is on the river. So, I don't know. Again, doesn't discount but doesn't prove it either. It's one of those like I see what you're saying, but I don't know how many of these are actually tropes at this point in time. As far as like 750 BC, but maybe they are. You need to see more stories from especially the region, like the Middle East, North Africa, even, just the Mediterranean region, the Arabian Peninsula, even into Persia, all that. If they're like, okay, we have this story here, that story, that these sort of like different tales that are kind of like taking influence from each other, then that would build more of a case.
of the Red Sea has much in common with ancient hero stories. Long before the Bible started to be written, crossing an important body of water was often used as a metaphor for leaving behind an old life and beginning a new one. I could go on, but my point is this.
I would like some examples, but hey, I can do my own research. He doesn't need. I'm not like I. I ain't getting on his case for it. It's a good video.
The biblical story of Moses is a beautifully crafted work of literature that took common themes and images used at the time.
See, I need to common themes and images used at the time. I get like, huh.
And wove them together to create a new story, one that explained Israel's origins and defended their most deeply held beliefs. Think of it this way. There are many Americans today whose ancestors were not at Plymouth Rock or around during the American Revolution, but they still celebrate Thanksgiving and the 4th of July. Likewise, even if the ancestors of most ancient Israelites weren't involved in a major exodus from Egypt, or even if the exodus never happened at all, the point is that the story and what it symbolized to them became an important part of their national identity. And not only that, the story of Moses also went on to inspire people in other parts of the world as well. So, in my view, the fact that it is not 100% historical doesn't lessen its value at
Um, again, he's talking about Moses specifically. In my opinion, it does lessen its value. It does. Um, because a lot of this is trying to give a foundational understanding of how a leader who is in consistent dialogue with God, um, what God is saying to them, what is being relayed, people will use that and have used that as a source to show God's character. And I don't agree with their usage of that. And so but it should be well understood that it's fiction, and that is very important, so that people do not take full stock of the way that God is being portrayed in these instances, because that is painting an inaccurate and unhealthy picture of God.
all. For well over 2,000 years, the story of Moses has both inspired those who have been oppressed and instructed those with power not to do the oppressing. A common theme found throughout the Torah is this one: You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were once strangers in the land of Egypt.
Yeah, that's one of the better ones. Though there's some stuff in there that's like, mm,
Considering the fact that racism and xenophobia are still major problems in the world today, I think a more important question than did Moses exist is, are we going to take to heart the main lesson from his story? As a reminder, be sure to check out the
okay, I mean, solid video. Solid video. Um, wonder if there's anything else in this category. Did Moses exist? Let's see if there's anything else, because that seems to be an interesting topic. Myth vision. Maybe. 1.1 million views. All right, let's see what you got, Butterisky. Let me
I also
hold on. Let's prep a fresh page. All right. All right. All right. What you got, buddy?
am interested if we have any good reason to think that the Exodus happened, because often
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of defense of the historicity of the New Testament, the reliability that we can compare and contrast and see that there's very few discrepancies.
Yeah.
But what do you say when someone says we've got really good evidence to think the Exodus never occurred? It's a nice fairy tale, it's a myth of a people, but it's not something that happened.
Yeah. I would say, okay, first of all, you're not going to get direct evidence of that because the Egyptians were masters of propaganda. So they never record any defeats or anything that goes wrong. Okay. So
Good
it's
for
kind of
them.
like, you know, kind of like,
Is that true? I don't know. Egyptians. I mean, did they record the sea peoples that wrecked them? But maybe that was okay because they were wrecking everybody. You know? Defeats? And they definitely record the sea peoples. I'm almost positive about that aspect.
Like our newspapers, you know, it's like the New York Times, you know, it's very ideological.
Yeah, the New York Times has never said anything bad about the government. No matter who's in charge, the New York Times is just singing the praises of whoever's in charge of our government because they are just state propaganda and da 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 da. I I I feel like we're off to a rough start here.
So that's how Egyptian historiography was. So you would not expect that a story of a massive defeat of one of the pharaohs, say Ramses II or something like that, where he lost a major part of his workforce, you know, and was defeated by a foreign god. That's never going to be recorded in Egyptian annals. So you can just forget like having direct attestation from the Egyptians. Now, what you can look for, though, is indirect evidence of authenticity. And what I find really compelling about the Exodus accounts is, in particular, the account of the building of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And what I find so fascinating about that is that when you look at how the tabernacle is built, it strongly resembles the Egyptian war tent of the pharaohs like Ramses II. And these pharaohs were gods, and when they would go on campaign up into Canaan, for example, they would reside in these big courtyards that were ringed around by curtains, and they would have like a tent in the middle, and this tent would have an outer court and an inner court, and the pharaoh would sit enthroned on the inner court on a throne with two cherubim on either side.
Wow.
Now we have pictures of this. We have ancient engravings of what these war tents look like, and the dimensions, the layout, it all resembles very similar to the layout of the tabernacle in the books of Exodus and thereafter. And what's so interesting about
That is fascinating. I don't know if that's if that's evidence to really prove anything as much as that's just an interesting factoid. Um Bulls. Yeah. I mean that is interesting. Hmm. Hmm.
that, Matt, is that it's been popular ever since, you know, the middle of the 1800s to suggest that the Pentateuch was actually written in the time of Ezra, you know, like 1,000 years after the events that it records, and it's all fictitious. Well, if it's being written in the time of Ezra, how is it that it matches up so well with Egyptian cultural realia of that time, of the new, what we call the New Kingdom period, which is often suggested as we're talking about like the 13th century BC, the 1200s BC, the time, you know, around Ramses II and before and a little bit after, within that time period. This is often suggested as the time of the Exodus, and in fact, the technology and the cultural forms that are described in the Exodus resemble that time period in Egypt. In fact, in King Tut's tomb, we have something that looks like the Ark of the Covenant. We have this big gold box on poles, only on top it's got a figure of the god Anubis, this like jackal-like god, or it's like dog god. And but anybody biblically literate looks at it like, wow, that looks like the Ark of the Covenant with a pagan god on top. And so what is going on? What I would argue, Matt, is that when Moses leads the people out of Egypt, he used
Hmm. I mean, did the Egyptians just stop using those? All right, let's just
Uses, some cultural forms and some cultural technology, even like the shape of different vessels and chairs and tents and so on like that they're familiar with because they built these things for Pharaoh. But Moses tells a radically different theological message with this material. So the Egyptians had this kind of sacred tent of Pharaoh, their god king, when they went out on war. Well, the Israelites go out into the desert and they organize themselves as an army too, as we see in, say, Numbers 10. They're waging the battles of the Lord, and but they have a tent, and in the sacred throne room of the tabernacle, you have the two cherubim that are signs of divinity and of royalty, but no idol, no image. This is the unseen God. This is the God that cannot be represented by animals or human form or whatever. And so we're using, and this makes sense to.
All right, so let's, you know,
To me, Matt, because you would want to use language and cultural forms that these Egyptian slaves could understand. So you want to use something that communicates, just like we want to. We use the form of the podcast, whatever, to communicate to our contemporaries, right? So you want to use cultural forms that communicate, but you want to say something radically different than what was said with them previously. And I think that's what we see in the Exodus. So that kind of indirect evidence, again, that to me is very strong that, yeah, this is being composed. This is reflecting the historical reality of the time period that it's describing.
So indirect evidence feels more compelling because it's accidental evidence, it seems.
As it were. Yeah. Right. The big stuff can be faked. If there was just some names dropped in the book of Exodus, well, you could say, well, some fiction writer looked up in a history.
I do always appreciate some of this sort of perspective because it's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. If we're using this as a way to show that information can be passed down for however long, then it's also understandable to say that it's even more reasonable to assume that they could reverse engineer and speak about the past since they know about the past so much that they are more capable of being able to reverse engineer and, fill in the details in a way that reflects the reality of the time period. So it's sort of this strange kind of thing where it's like, how could they do this? And it's like, well, if they were capable of holding these records for so long, all the way up until 750 BC about stuff that happened, 1500, 1400 BC, then it means that they are actually far more capable of reproducing something that would reflect that time period while not being entirely true. Or you have more tools at your disposal to write historical fiction when you have information that has come from so long ago up until this point. You're just more capable at doing it. So it's like, okay, that doesn't prove that they had to have written like that this is authentic because we do understand that certain things can get passed down, information and understanding of the past and how the past used to function to where you can write more accurate historical fiction. You know, it's one of those funky sort of situations. So it is fascinating, though, that the tabernacle resembles a pharaoh's war tent. It is fascinating that, you know, the Israelites copied Egyptian iconography, such as the ark is extremely similar to other vessels used by the Egyptians. This is all very interesting.
Book and found some names of some pharaohs to drop, but when it's embedded into, as it were, the culture of the Pentateuch, that's even stronger. And then too, we have from the Egyptian Second Temple, excuse me, from the Egyptian New Kingdom period, we also have a whole bunch of treaty documents, covenant documents between, say, the Pharaoh and the king of Hatti land, or the Hittite Empire, which we would know as Asia Minor. So these were major empires that kind of intersected in what's now Israel. They kind of had a border there. And so they made treaties back and forth with one another. And the fascinating thing about these treaty covenants that we've discovered, and we have several of them, they're written in Egyptian, and there's a copy in Hittite, and also in the international language at that time, which was Akkadian, and you don't want to go onto all that and get down on a rabbit trail, but different languages these covenants are preserved in, and the structure of them looks like the Book of Deuteronomy. With an introduction and then kind of a historical prologue about the past history of the covenant parties. And then we get into some major like constitutional principles. And then we get into a whole bunch of very specific laws. And then we end with instructions about how to store the treaty document and how often it should be read publicly, and a list of blessings for following the covenant and curses for breaking the covenant. Boom, 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 boom. This has been known for since the 1950s at least. This material, has come out. It's like, dang, the Book of Deuteronomy is following this covenant treaty format that we can attest to the time period that many have proposed as the time period of the Exodus. And what do we know about Moses? Well, he was raised in the Egyptian royal court where they were sending these documents. This is like, political, international politics with international political treaties that were passing back and forth. And Moses, if he was raised in the court of Pharaoh, would have been trained to read these languages.
Was there a time when treaties like this stopped sounding like this? And how far back can we go that treaties, when did these treaties start sounding like this, and when did they stop sounding like this? That would be an interesting question. And also, I don't have necessarily any sort of like yeah, I don't, again, I do fall under the idea that the people who wrote the Torah are doing their best to write down what they believe is historically accurate. I do believe that they are trying to do that. Maybe with some embellishment here and there. Sure. But I do think that they are trying to put forward history and not just like this stuff is like, okay, yeah, I am definitely not under the idea that this is just 100% just complete fabrication.
And read these political documents and be familiar with them and how to engage in, international diplomacy. So, Moses would be a natural person to be able to write such a document, not between two great foreign kings, but between the king of creation, God himself.
So yeah, so this is how we know the Exodus really happened. No, it's how we know that the Exodus isn't a complete fabrication. not a complete fabrication, but maybe. But some of these parts, it's like are you saying that it's not impossible for them to write something that resembles the past? That's not impossible. That's not crazy either. I think it would be. I don't think that's what happened. That they were just like trying to mishmash and sort of. I do think that this stuff was passed down and they probably still had documents from those time periods, but not like all of it. You know, they had to kind of fill in the blanks, but they probably had some stuff written down here and there.
Self and his covenant people.
We just don't have those documents anymore, so it's up for interpretation. Okay, interesting video.
Also seems to be referring to Deuteronomy 30:19, where heaven and earth are called upon to testify other Hebrews out of Egypt in the 13th century.
Alright, let's take a smoke break here, a cigarette break. Alright. Also, my stomach's feeling kind of funky. Quit with the coffee and we'll just stick with the water. Nothing fails like Bible. Oh no. The invention of Moses. Myth Vision podcast. Oh goodness, that's definitely some anti. Alright. This could be interesting. Is that the one we have? No, let's. Yeah, I think we can. Let's go with this. Next.
After the
As we discover the wandering period. Alright. Cigarette break, then we'll get back to it. Alright, let's get back to it. What to go with next? Um, hmm. Um,
Children of Israel
see
and the
what we
mixed
got here.
multitude left Egypt. They were sentenced to wander in the desert for 40 years. The Pentateuch says many Israelite religious customs and rituals were laid down during this time period. If this is true, then the Israelites would have been heavily influenced by an Egyptian mentality, and most of their customs should have Egyptian markers or correlations with the second millennium BCE. But if these Israelite customs were made up at a later time, then we should find more affinity to Assyrian customs or markers from the first millennium BCE. However, the events and customs found in Exodus through Deuteronomy do not fit with markers that would indicate a later tradition. Instead, within the Pentateuch, we find evidence of a group that had more affinity with an early Egyptian culture. Strengthening the case, what we read goes back to the culture that experienced an exodus from Egypt, as they reported.
Which, yeah, I am, like, currently, I'm definitely do believe that the Israelites at least spent significant time in Egypt before coming out. Like, I do see some evidence of that earlier than what is typically put as the time period. Um, so there is that. Alright, let me write this stuff down. Sounds like he's gonna mention some stuff from what that other dude mentioned. But with it being a longer video, hopefully we'll get more in depth.
When people look for evidence of Israel's time in the desert, they often want archaeological remains. But such a request is unlikely to be fulfilled. Richard Elliott Friedman notes that skeptics assert we've combed the Sinai and not found any evidence. That assertion is just not true. There have not been any major excavations in the Sinai. Additionally, even if Sinai was excavated, it is unlikely we would find anything at all. Baruch Halpern notes that land armies did traverse that terrain without leaving detected archaeological traces. B.C. Sparks says semi-nomadic people and continual caravan crossings do not leave special, identifiable ruts in the hard gravel or the soft sand. One rut looks like another. Nor do they usually leave inscriptions with labels identifying the travelers, or the herders and the dates of their migration. Ernst Knopf quibs that pottery does not give passport information, and almost never is it possible to identify the nationality of a cooking pot.
Yeah.
The archaeological invisibility of tent-dwelling nomads, as well as transient caravans and migrants, and the lower classes in sedentary populations, make it difficult, though not impossible, to find some scattered traces. Over time, weathering would have destroyed a lot of the data that would have been left behind. In the region of southern Canaan, Erez ben Yosef worked on an archaeological site that displayed remains of tent dwellers, but also reports the lion's share of such remains was entirely washed away by massive floods. And thus, even if such surveys were more comprehensive, they would still provide only fragmentary information. B.C. Sparks also employed a mathematical comparison to help explain the odds of finding remains of the Israelites in the desert. He notes census data indicates the population of the Bedouin tribes of the Sinai Peninsula is roughly 40,000 and has been static in terms of growth for centuries. Yet we lack the overwhelming amount of the burials of hundreds of thousands to millions of Bedouins in some 100 to 200 generations since the Bronze Age. If the Exodus was actually comprised of 2 million people who remained in the region for only about 40 years, it would be the equivalent of finding evidence of 20,000 nomads over the course of 4,000 years. Sparks notes that the remains for millions who lived in the Sinai over the past 4,000 years is missing. Yet we do not think they did not exist just because the remains have not been found. Likewise, given that the Exodus population
So it sounds like the Sinai, what I'm hearing, potentially without outside, serious outside help, can only support around 40,000 people. Consistently. 2 million living there for 40 years? No. No. Um, yeah, I mean, they call it the Sinai. It's a desert. It's desolate. There's no nutrients to be found. Your livestock would eat everything in sight. The people would go starving. Um, there's just no feasible way. Yeah. So, yeah, he kind of like, it's interesting. Let's see.
also employed a mathematical comparison to help explain the odds of finding remains of the Israelites in the desert. He notes census data indicates the population of the Bedouin tribes of the Sinai Peninsula is roughly 40,000 and has been static in terms of growth for centuries.
For centuries, hundreds of years, it has stayed at 40,000 people because that is basically what the Sinai can reasonably support with its just, lack of nutrients, lack of, lack of, grazing land, fresh water, all these different factors. For centuries, 40,000 people, and yet 2 million lived there for 40 years. Not 40 days passing through. Maybe they could, if you have enough reserves, you could probably live there if you have like a crazy amount of grain reserves. Maybe 5, maybe 10 years. Maybe even, maybe, okay, 5, 10, yeah, crazy amounts of grain reserves. Yeah. Um, and then you need all the hay for the animals to eat, because these are primarily, shepherds by trade, generally speaking, or they were at least beforehand. I don't know if they kept that ability up, but you know. Um, Funny how this one note that he uses to discuss the discoverability of artifacts is like more striking to me and more damning that the figure of 2 million people is completely absurd.
Yet we lack the overwhelming amount of the burials of hundreds of thousands to millions of Bedouins in some 100 to 200 generations since the Bronze Age. If the Exodus was actually comprised of 2 million people who remained in the region for only about 40 years, it would be the equivalent of finding
Only about 40 years. It's only 40 years in a desolate desert that doesn't have anything where people can survive in the numbers of millions.
evidence of 20,000 nomads over the course of 4,000 years. Sparks notes that the remains for millions who lived in the Sinai over the past 4,000 years is missing. Yet we do not think they did not exist just because the remains have not been found. Likewise, given that the Exodus population was most likely far less than 2 million, and they were only there for 40 years, it is incredibly unlikely we would
Far less, as in at most 60,000. At most. Maybe even less than that. at most 60. Um, according to some of the archaeological data that I've sifted through for Genesis with Joseph and that whole aspect, 20 to 30,000 seems to be around the number we should be considering.
Even find evidence of Israel's wandering period. However, that alone doesn't mean there is no evidence to help support the historicity of the wandering time. The Hebrews left behind an account of their time in the desert, which can be examined and scrutinized. The Hebrews, and the mixed multitude that went with them, had spent generations in Egypt. If the account is based on an historical event, the people would have acted and thought in terms of the late 2nd millennium BCE culture and Egyptian customs.
Doesn't that look like chess? Doesn't that look like those Egyptians are, if this is an actual painting, not just some like random something or other that was found, or this like a recreate, but it looks like he's playing chess right there in the middle. I don't know if that's an actual painting or somebody's creative interpretation.
And rituals from the same time. If the Exodus is the work of later writers, we should find evidence of anachronisms in the text that fit with the later Iron Age or Babylonian periods. But when we dive into the Pentateuch, we find evidence of several internal clues that fit with an Egyptian culture from an earlier time period that later forgers would have had a hard time concocting.
I mean, maybe. Again, if texts like that survive, if information can survive all the way up until that point, then it's more feasible to even, make the assumption that it was. Again, we've been over this. It's just an interesting kind of like the snake eating itself kind of argument, in my opinion.
The most interesting thing that happened while Israel was in the desert was the construction of the Ark of the Covenant. But Egyptologist David Falk says, the Ark of the Covenant, as we know it from the Hebrew Bible, is steeped in the culture and context of its time. The Late Bronze Age, circa 1500 to 1200 BCE. The Ark was constructed by borrowing elements from numerous features found in Egyptian ritualistic furniture. Cultic chests appear frequently in Egyptian history and were often used for transporting sacred objects, and had long removable poles attached to the base. Often they were wood boxes covered with gold inside and out, had a sacred cloth draped over them, and had a lid with sacred statuary like the mercy seat. Yet these features are also seen in the construction of the Ark. In ancient Egypt, building shrines for the gods was very important, and often the Egyptians would construct special shrines called barks, modeled after boats. Egyptian priests would transport the idol in a bark. The Ark didn't contain an idol on top of it, but Dr. Falk notes it also contains similar features to Egyptian shrines and barks. It functioned as a shrine where God would meet with the children of Israel. The Ark is an ideal fit as
well, also, I mean, they built the Ark. I believe the instructions. Hold on. Did the instructions come before or after they built the idol? That's the question. I think the instructions supposedly, as far as the biblical text is concerned, which sometimes I question its, how well it does with chronological happenings. But, hold on. Tabernacle, yeah. So they kind of make their own, yeah, the golden calf comes before or after? I mean, it comes before they make the ark, but the golden calf happens after the instructions of the ark, right? Tabernacle, yeah. So the instructions are handed down And before Moses is, while he's there the first time up on the mountain. And then the people make a golden calf. But it is interesting because it seems like if we're just going by the biblical text, God had a feeling they needed something, a physical substance, for the people to gravitate towards. That this is where God is. You know, God resides in this place because that's where the ark is, and there's a physical kind of object that is like, this is God's sacred vessel. God doesn't reside in it. That's like sort of a representation because it kind of just, helps with the sort of visualization, and it also helps with what they were used to in Egypt, because without the ark, with God being just like, lack of better words, invisible. Sure there were different manifestations that were there, but people still were like, not good enough. Not good enough. We need something physical, So there you go. Then God's like, all right, build the ark. That way the people will be satisfied that there is some kind of something that they can get behind. Not just some God of the universe.
As ritual processional furniture and follows an Egyptian design pattern. Was the ark a bark, a coffin, a chest, a reliquary, or a throne? Yes, and so much more. More interestingly, is the artistic features of the ark fit with a specific time period of Egyptian history? The pair of cherubs facing each other fits with Egyptian chests from the time of Amenhotep III onward. Later during the time of Ramesses II, a type of Egyptian furniture called a palanquin throne, which was an exposed throne, often were made with winged goddesses protecting each side of the throne. However, in later times, these features fell out of fashion and were no longer used, and are also not seen in any time period before Amenhotep III. Therefore, the ark's deconstruction and the features fell out of fashion.
Let's see here. Interesting. So, I remember watching a documentary where they proposed that the Israelites actually left in the late Middle Kingdom. And what if this is a strange situation where it's actually the Egyptians copying the Israelites? Rather than the other way around. Egyptian correlations with the ark is all the way over here.
Were no longer used, and are also not seen in any The pair of cherubs facing each other and follows an Egyptian design pattern. Was the ark a bark, a coffin, a chest, a reliquary, or a throne? Yes, and so much more. More interestingly, is the artistic features of the ark fit with a specific time period of Egyptian history? The pair of cherubs facing each other fits with Egyptian chests from the time of Amenhotep III onward. Later during the time of Ramesses II, a type of Egyptian furniture called a palanquin throne, which was an exposed throne, often were made with winged goddesses protecting each side of the throne. However, in later times, these features fell out of fashion and were no longer used, and are also not seen in any time period before Amenhotep III. Therefore, the ark's deconstruction and the dating of its symbols suggest the ark was made no earlier than the reign of King Amenhotep III and no later than the end of Dynasty 20. The Ark of the Covenant fits extremely well with Egyptian ritualistic furniture customs, and specifically fits with the time period around the Ramesside dynasty. Other cultic features from the Exodus narrative also fit within Egyptian culture. When the Israelites made furniture for the tabernacle, they followed Egyptian techniques. In Exodus 27, the altar is said to have horns on it, which fits with the Egyptian description of altars from the Tutmos side period and afterwards. The altar of the tabernacle was metal laid over a wooden base. This is a common practice found among the Egyptians, who rarely made altars out of stone. In the Levant, building stone altars was the standard custom. In the biblical texts, the altar of the tabernacle was constructed in the Egyptian method. But once we see the Israelites move into Canaan, they started building altars out of stone, the standard Levantine practice. In the high priest's breastplate, we hear that there was a turquoise gemstone. A 2017 study indicated turquoise was rarely found in Mesopotamia and Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, and is virtually absent in the archaeological record of Egypt and the Near East after the 12th century BC. In fact, James Hoffmeyer notes, a survey of Babylonian and Assyrian texts indicates there was no known word for turquoise. However, the Egyptian mined the Sinai for turquoise, which lasted until P-Ramesses was deserted. And the word the Hebrews used for turquoise appears to have entered their language from Egyptian prior to the first millennium BCE. Thus, the use of turquoise and the Hebrew word for it fits with an Egyptian culture from prior to the abandonment of P-Ramesses. Beyond this, Hoffmeyer lists other Egyptian aspects for the design of the tabernacle. Many of the wooden objects, like the tent poles, were overlaid with a gold foil, which was a technique mastered in Egypt. The word for the priest's linen in the book of Exodus stems from an Egyptian loanword, suggesting an early and Egyptian origin for the priest's linen in the Exodus account. The priests also were to wear undergarments to cover their privates. Undergarments were discovered in tombs of priests in Egypt. The menorah and fire pan appear to have had some Egyptian influence, and many of the words used in describing the priest's attire seem to have come from Egyptian words. Even the encampment of Israel fits with a Ramesside time period. Ramesses' military camps were set up in a rectangular fashion, with an entrance in the middle of the eastern wall. The pharaoh resided in the middle, with a reception tent, and his throne was symbolized with two falcons facing each other, with their wings spread out. The Book of Numbers states Israel encamped in a similar fashion, with the ark in the center, which had two winged cherubs on it. The style of the encampment doesn't fit with later times, as Neo-Assyrian camps were oval-shaped. Joshua Berman says, the military camp at Kadesh constitutes the closest parallel to the tabernacle, including the Temple of Solomon, known to date. The tent of Yahweh, the divine warrior, parallels the tent of the pharaoh, the living Egyptian god, posed for battle. Certain practices in the timing of Israelite festivals also have more affinity with the second millennium and seem to be attempts at cultic competition within the Levant. Richard Hess notes during the end of the Bronze Age, the West Semitic city of Emmer reached its peak. When Emmer thrived in the 14th and 13th century BCE, it had a lot of influence over the Levant and the surrounding areas. Richard Hess and Kenneth Kitchen note the cultic practices and festivals at Emmer are similar to what we read in the Pentateuch, showing the Bible has cultic affinity to the Late Bronze Age. Emmer 369 notes priests were anointed with oil, like what we read in Leviticus 8. Leviticus 10 notes a ritual with fire was performed that was forbidden by God. We see a similar practice at Emmer, where a torch was used to meet with a deity on the first day of the priest's installment. Hess suggests in Leviticus 10 the two rebellious priests may have been participating in a similar ritual that honored another deity. The Pentateuch talks about the differences between the priests, the sons of Aaron, and the rest of the Levites. The priests served inside the sanctuary, and the rest of the Levites did the work outside of the sanctuary. We see a similar structure in Hittite temples, where one class works inside the temple and another class works outside. The biblical punishments for infringements are also similar to what we see in Hittite and Egyptian customs during this time period. We see rituals concerning the transfer of evil to an animal and expelling them into the land. This occurs in numerous ritual documents from the ancient Near East, but the biblical version mostly resembles the older Hittite versions, not later Iron Age versions. At Emmer, the installation of a priestess took 9 days, comparable to the biblical time frame. Emmer had a festival every 7 years in autumn called Zukru that revolved around the god Dagon, which had several similarities with Israelite festivals. we can see similarities to the Passover and Festival of Unleavened Bread. Both are referred to with the same Semitic verbal root. Both required the roasting of a lamb and the hiding of the deity's face. For both, twilight is a critical time. Both require a 7-day sequence and began on the 15th day of the first month. Both bring out holy relics for an important meal and special bread and drink.
Sukru. Huh.
And with an important focus on family. Zukru as a ritual where oil and blood are rubbed on stones. Similar to the biblical feast, Hess says, the only other example of anointing with both blood and oil is found in the installation of the priest in Leviticus 8:30. Another text from Emmer is a ritual calendar that has several similarities to Israelite festivals, which are found in Leviticus 23. First, both calendars reflect more interest in one half of the year, focusing on spring and autumn. Both calendars use the name of the month as the primary means of identifying the month and how the text is organized. For the first and last month, Leviticus 23 identifies the ritual actions that occurred by introducing each one with a phrase that includes the paid preposition, the number of the days, and the word for month. Parallels can be found in the ritualistic calendar found at Emmer, as well as in other Akkadian and Ugaritic calendars. Hess says, the biblical Feast of Weeks that occurs in the middle of the calendar resembles the description of the Emmer festivals during the months of Anna. In both cases, these are intermediate, occurring between major festivals at the beginning and the end of the calendar. In both cases, specifics as to the particular day of the month are missing. Therefore, it seems unlikely that a single standard formula can be identified for introducing calendar festivals. The Emmer calendar demonstrates that such variation by itself does not prove a later editorial innovation. Emmer Zukru festival had rituals and timing that were similar to the Israelite Feast of Booths. Although Zukru was only once every 7 years, Daniel Fleming notes it was also a 7-day interval with special attention to the first and last day. Both also occur on the 15th day of the month. In its 7th year cycle, the timing of the Zukru matches exactly the covenant renewal of the Feast of Booths, prescribed for Israel in Deuteronomy 31. In Leviticus 23, there are 2 descriptions of the feast with different actions that were to occur. Some argue this is evidence of different sources combined into one, or that a later addition was added in. But at Emmer, we have different rituals that were performed during parallel periods. Richard Hess says, in both ritual calendars, the differences in various details are matched by parallel periods of time when the feasts were celebrated, and by similar general actions during the holidays. The similarities suggest that a second description of a ritual occurring on the same day or days as the first, and positioned soon after the first description in a text, does not by itself indicate that it is an editorial addition. Next, Leviticus 23 varies in how much detail is given to explaining each feast. The same is true for the ritual calendar at Emmer. Some feasts are only mentioned in a single line, and a lot of details given to others. Both calendars are uneven in how much detail is given to each festival. Emmer also had a festival in the spring dedicated to the warrior and storm god Baal, which occurred at the same time as Passover. Passover also associates the God of Israel with a warrior persona who fought against Egypt and delivered Israel from slavery. Now, despite the similarities, we have to note there are also a lot of differences between the biblical festivals and the festivals at Emmer. However, the similarities suggest they emerge from the same type of culture and time period.
Sorry, I'm not talking a lot because I'm right now. My stomach's not feeling too good. Not sure what's going on there. It's kind of distracting me a decent amount. Trying to stay focused, but I'm failing. I might have to come back to this at a later date. Shoot, I might have to. Hard to research when you're just mind's in another place. Because this is all fascinating. This is very fascinating. I need to be taking notes, and right now I'm just like, I have to cut today short and just get back to it tomorrow when my mind is more clear. Hmm. I mean, so far, this is like, oh, so the Israelites are unoriginal. It's like, oh, didn't realize how unoriginal the Israelites are. Interesting. And yet they don't want to give any credit to. It's like, oh, God told us to build this. It's like, wait, does this like kind of bring it more into question? Like, in nowhere in the text is like the Pharaoh's war tent. Remember the Pharaoh's war tent? Build it like that. Here, let me instruct you. Like if they're actually God's being completely unoriginal with all this. If God is actually speaking in these instances, it's like, wait, what? So none of this is like original? This isn't some like really well, of course. I mean, think about it, like it's what the Israelites, dude. I'm pretty sure God could have built all kinds of different stuff that might have had some influence, but it seems like it's copy and pasted. The whole layout is the same. So it's if anything that like makes me think that this is some copy pasta going on from Moses, and God's like, yes, God wants the same reliquary, the same stuff that the Egyptians have. The Egyptian, because God's like, let's just do what the Egyptians are doing. I don't want to think too hard about this, Moses. Just give me what the Egyptians give their supreme leader and gods. And just do it for me. We'll keep this simple. Y'all already know how to build it. I don't want to complicate things for y'all. Oh, what a none of this is original, which is very fascinating that the Israelites are just copying. Uh, that's why it would be more interesting to me if actually the Egyptians are copying the Israelites and they're actually having original thoughts that would give me more credence to the idea that some of these instructions actually came from God. Currently, it just doesn't seem to be the case. Yeah. Uh, I mean, it would be more, you know, give a little bit more credence if it was like if the text was like, do this like the Egyptians, if there was some credit given to the fact that this is copying pasting what the Egyptians had done. Maybe that would give a little bit more like, you know.
17 study indicated turquoise was rarely found in Mesopotamia and Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, and is virtually absent in the archaeological record of Egypt and the Near.
After see when my operates high ceased with the demise of the new kingdom. Okay. I didn't realize turquoise was mentioned. Was it? Was it? Ay ay ay. Hold on. Alright. The FO'd. or ephod, however you say it. No, that's consecration. All right, priest garments. Da 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 da. Sardius, topaz, carbuncle, emerald, sapphire, diamond, jacinth, agate, amethyst, beryl, onyx, jasper. Okay, so maybe sardius or carbuncle. Or maybe it's jacinth? Which one of these is supposed to be turquoise? I don't know. One of these is supposed to be turquoise. Apparently.
Near East after the 12th century BC. In fact, James Hoffmeyer notes a survey of Babylonian and Assyrian texts indicates there was no known word for turquoise. However, the Egyptian mined the Sinai for turquoise, which lasted until P-Ramesses was deserted. And the word the Hebrews used for turquoise appears to have entered their language from Egyptian.
Mifkut? Mifkut? It's one of these. Sardius, carbuncle, jacinth. I don't know. The English Standard Version isn't giving me even a transliteration of the word. If it is, the word that's being used here is not.
Prior to the first millennium BCE. Thus, the use of turquoise and the Hebrew word for it fits within Egyptian culture from prior to the abandonment of P-Ramesses. Beyond,
I mean, generally speaking, well, I don't know. I'm sure people have been finding turquoise in the area beforehand, but maybe they just was super rare. So it's like blue colored stone. You know? Bluish green colored stone.
on this, Hoffmeyer lists other Egyptian aspects for the design of the tabernacle. Many of the wooden objects, like the tent poles, were overlaid with a gold foil, which was a technique mastered in Egypt. The word for the priest's linen in the book of Exodus stems from an Egyptian loanword, suggesting an early and Egyptian origin for the priest's linen in the Exodus account. The priests also were to wear undergarments to cover their privates. Undergarments were discovered in tombs of priests in Egypt. The menorah and fire pan appear to have had some Egyptian influence, and many of the words used.
At least it's like some Egypt. The menorah seems pretty, original. I'll give the menorah that. That seems original.
In describing the priest's attire seem to have come from Egyptian words. Even the encampment of Israel fits with a Ramesside time period. Ramesses' military camps were set up in a rectangular fashion, with an entrance in the middle of the eastern wall. The pharaoh resided in the middle with a reception tent, and his throne was symbolized with two falcons facing each other with their wings.
Alright, y'all. My body's just not feeling it today. I don't know. I'm gonna cut it short because I can't research like this with my body just getting in the way of me focusing and considering. So I don't want to like skip through this and then yeah. Alright, I'm gonna cut it short. Y'all have a good day. Peace.